Lubrication. Oil pump, bearings, clearances, catch cans, cylinder wall lubrication, dry sump versus wet sump. So let's talk about an oil pump. What's an oil pump do?
It's, pretty basic.
It's kind of like your heart.
It just pumps oil and funny how such a simple component can be so critical. However, it's also critically relying on several other components, not just to function properly, but be designed properly.
Yep.
Otherwise, it is just your engine died because your oil pump sucks, or oil pump failed. Well,
why did the oil
pump fail?
Right.
Is the question most people don't ask. And
the much vaulted and respected 997.2 4.0 RS, generally for those that have owned them, are known as the oil pump eaters, because the thing that we were just talking about with the crankshaft and resonance and other accumulated things, because the 4.0 RS probably didn't go through all of the engineering studies it should have. It seems to probably be a little bit more
from the racing world, and then they derived and took the race car RSR parts and put them into the street car use,
which were never used at 3,000 RPM on the highway consecutively to allow that crankshaft to really start vibrating.
Somebody took the 4.0 RSR out on the street.
Yeah, they just shoved it in a freaking street car and
they just
rip on it
and then went around and
yeah. So that car would eat oil pumps, and an oil pump is essentially a gear drive off of the crankshaft that pumps the oil around the engine. Now, there's lots of... Perfect. Yeah. So he's got a picture that he's going to add of what that looks like. It has a pickup, which looks like a disc with a screen on it. Mm-hmm. That's in... let's talk about sumps for a second. So there are what are called dry sump and wet sump. A sump, essentially, at its gist, is container, is a bucket.
It's just the bottom of the engine, whether it's a flat motor, inline, V, whichever, four-cylinder.
The place where the oil might end up if gravity was the only thing that was affecting it. It would just get there. So a dry sump engine pulls it quickly out of that V, or that bottom area underneath the crankshaft, and it pulls it into a tank where it keeps it. And that's really good for things that have high G load. Race cars, for instance. When they're cornering, all of that oil is going to want to go to one side of the sump, and it could, depending on how the sump is designed, end up being away from where that disc with the screen is. All the oil is going to be over here, and the screen's going to be over here, and it's going to suck air, not oil.
Everyone who does any sort of NASA SCCA racing, for sure, with the wet sump engine, which pretty much everything's wet sump, they all have battled, or they know somebody who's battled oil starvation from high G loads, or even if it's not fully uncovered, you get just a little bit where you suck a little bit of air in, you get a little bit of intermittent, a little bit of aeration, foaming of the oil. Well, at this point, you don't have liquid. You now have a partially
bubbly, viscous mixture of stuff that doesn't get into bearings and create clearances. It just allows everything to collapse.
You have to remove all the air from the oil separator, which I call it air-oil separator, an actual piece, which is very important.
Which is the whole catch can thing versus an air-oil separator. We'll come to that. What Charles was just talking about, a wet sump engine leaves all of the oil in a box at the bottom of the engine, and they have to do things like windage trays and trap doors and all of these fancy things, so that if the oil's trying to move in a G load, they try and hold it next to the oil pump pickup somehow, so that it can continue to lubricate the engine.
Anyone who's seen this engine, 981, 991 Carrera DFI engine, turbo, whichever, oil pan on it is pretty wide. It's not deep. It's really wide. Pretty thin. And the idea is oil goes back into the oil pan, and there's the oil pump that's in there. But there are, I don't remember how many, there's a couple
channels
in
and baffles.
There's a couple baffles so that the oil, they're trying to keep all the oil in the middle of the oil pan. And then they're trying to, you drive the car and you get the G-forces and all the oil sloshes around. They're trying to, every time the oil moves side to side or even front to back, you're trying to trap it all in the middle to keep it around the pickup.
Yep.
Now, something a lot of people don't consider is your gas tank. Actually, I'm not transitioning here.
Yeah.
The gas tank around the fuel pump pickup has a container around it to hold fuel in it.
Yep.
Otherwise, every time you cornered in your car enough or went around a corner or on the freeway, you would just uncover the pickup and your engine would just die. So they have to create, and a lot of old cars, 50s, 60s, 70s, don't have that. So you go fast enough around a corner, they actually just run out of gas. Newer technology is great, of course, but the wet sump oil setups nowadays are better. Porsche actually calls it integrated dry sump.
Yeah, an in situ dry sump, which it's not wrong. It's just marketing speak for a good wet sump design. It's not a dry sump.
It's complex. They still have all the same pickups where from the cylinder head this way,
Yep.
all the oil goes down to the bottom. So you got to suck it out from the bottom.
Yep.
There's 2 oil pumps on some of these engines for that. And they got to pump it back into the oil pan. And a dry sump engine, they pump it back to the tank.
Correct.
And then even though you have all this oil, even in a dry sump engine or wet sump, you're not just sucking pure oil from there. So you have air that pump positive displacement. So if it gets to the point where there's not enough, it's not covered in fluid. It's going to suck air as well. And then now it's pumping air back into the oil tank. So now it has to separate that as well.
A positive displacement pump essentially means 2 gears meshing with some liquid, with some space in between them that allows for fluid to be captured and pushed to one side, is what a positive displacement pump means. So if you have air mixed in with the oil, because air is compressible and oil generally is not, then it'll compress and you won't move as much volume through the gears as you might have otherwise, and you can end up with aeration and not enough oil moving through the system. A visual
for some, especially old school guys, a Roots blower, top fuel dragster. That is a positive displacement blower. You move it 1 turn, it physically pumps into a certain displacement of air. Centrifugal supercharger, turbocharger, a vane style pump. You move that a certain amount and you actually didn't displace a certain amount of volume per rotation. That's based on other physics for some other year. But
it's compressible gas stuff.
But that's another day. So catch can, something which I see as a Band-Aid. It works for some people. Generally, a car that needs a catch can is a car that has a blow-by issue.
Yes, it generally has another issue.
So, or there in the import world, drag race world, drift world, for sure. A lot of guys, it's dumping oil out, put a catch can on it. Well, or it's only doing this at 50 pounds of boost. Well, that means you're not, 30 pounds of boost, it's fine. It means 50 pounds of boost, you have a ring seal problem. Maybe you have a piston ring.
You're pushing oil past the rings and
compression gases are just going by it. So there's that. Dry sump engines generally don't have catch cans because usually the whole tank and breather assembly is sealed, other than a breather line, usually to the intake or somewhere external. Now there's also Porsche dry sump engines, newer, not all of them from a certain point, but generally everything from 2004 and newer, they actually pull a vacuum in the crankcase. That's something a lot of people don't know. On the 991 GT3 engines, the actual main source of brake boost is supplied from the crankcase. The crankcase will pull 25 inches of vacuum. The oil pump, there's 9 oil pumps in this big oil pump assembly. I think I actually have one somewhere. And it will pull it is trying to, quote, suck so much oil out of the crankcase to put it back in the tank. It's actually removing the air, because again, air isn't nothing. There's molecules here. It is removing all of that from the crankcase, putting it in the tank. Eventually it will lower the pressure in the crankcase down about 25 inches, around 2,000 RPMs and up, and there's a limiting valve there. And that's what they use for brake booster on those cars, which is more than most engines that have a vacuum booster off the intake manifold that are 15, 20 inches or so. But that's how good dry sump is and can be when it's set up correctly. But it's great. There's still a few areas where you still have to deal with engineering exercises on it. Not that there's Porsche's doing anything wrong, but one example a few people have asked is, those of you guys that have a 997 GT3, that will take for a full fill. A 2007 GT3 will take about 12 to 13 quarts of oil. A 991 GT3 on a good day will take 6.5, maybe. And that's about it.
And this is part of some of what you guys don't understand is there is a total lifetime impact number that these cars have that the EPA will consider as part of their impact on the environment. And the total amount of oil that they will consume over their lifetime through oil changes and the like is part of that number. And that's why you see this number going down and down and down and down. It isn't for the longevity of the engine. More oil is better. More oil that you can put in a dry sump is better because you can keep it cooler. You can allow it some time to get the bubbles out.
Higher thermal standpoint. You have more oil, more mass to absorb the thermal impact from the engine. But every time you have to, this is something else a lot of people don't know. Every time you take a car, you make a car, Porsche says, hey, we have a car, or anyone. And what's your maintenance history on it? What's your interval? How often do you have to change the oil? How much oil? Well, okay, so every 3,000 miles, you got to dump 10 quarts of oil. But how long are people going to drive the car? 10,000 miles a year. So you're going to dump 12 quarts of oil 3 times a year. That's 36 quarts. That's 9 gallons of oil you're going to dispose of every year. Well, in the EPA's manner or eyes, that's a pollutant. It's got to go somewhere. That's tailpipe emissions. Well, that's in another category of emissions, not widely known. Well, new oil nowadays is really good. Most oils nowadays are good, or at least companies make oil. A lot of small companies make better oil. And there's a point where the oil will break down over a certain amount of time. It gets contaminated. The base number reduces. You have acidity from combustion byproducts.
Fuel additive to it.
And then you have to change it. Eventually, the oil no longer sticks to engine parts and lubricates. So you have to dispose of it and do an oil change, oil filter change, and such. And the more often you have to do that, the more, or claimed, then
the more
the manufacturer has to pay fines for that, essentially. So that's why there's a lot of the mileage of, you go 20,000 miles on your oil.
I mean, you get some of these new Hondas or new Accords and you don't have to do an oil change for 15,000 miles. That wasn't necessarily to the benefit of the engine's life. That was something
if you got in the car and drove 15,000 miles on the freeway for the most part nonstop,
it's probably okay.
Probably could. It's probably fine. It's
you did a road rally and held the engine at its maximum RPM the whole time and turned it off every 10 minutes and turned it back on and let it get cooled and all that stuff. It's not great.
Or even the short trip, start your car, turn it up, go to 7-Eleven, get a Slurpee, drive back home, 2 minutes.
Turn it off.
Engine barely warmed up. Oil didn't warm up enough. You got to get the oil warm enough or hot. Because it will condense moisture as it cools off. You need to boil the water out of the oil.
That's right.
That's a major, and that's one reason that I think Porsche has less oil in the new GT cars is because it takes longer to heat up 12, 13 quarts of oil than it does 4 or 5 or 6 quarts, which these cars warm up really quick. Oil gets up to temp pretty quick. It'll boil
because they know that their consumers aren't going to warm it up, and they've been told by Greta and others that you can't warm your car up. Because the emissions.
It's bad for the engine.
It's bad for the engine. Bad things are going to happen if you warm up your engine. I'm not sure what bad things are going to happen when you warm up your engine.
Most guys who've had, which like yourself included, a 997, 996 GT3, and then a 991 GT3 have had that. Where you might drive your 997 GT3 and be like, it never gets over 170, 180.
It
might not.
It might.
The 991 GT3, a 991.2 GT2 RS in regular mode, that engine will run pretty happy. It will run 230, 232 coolant temp, and 240, 250 oil temp. By design, it'll run that hot for
very
emissions,
happy.
and it's just happy, and it's made to run that way, and that's not by design for longevity. That's emissions. You hit the sport button, and everything drops.